We are not going to stand by while you destroy this country.
Red Freight. You are the ones who are destroying this country.
In front of cameras, she sneered, "Go back to India." The words landed like a slap across the face of the room. For a heartbeat, silence swallowed the air. Every reporter's pen froze mid-stroke. Every camera lens zoomed in tighter. Every breath felt like it belonged to someone else. The insult didn't just echo, it detonated. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a low gasp that swelled into scattered shouts. Some mouths curled in disbelief, others twisted into smirks of satisfaction, but no one could escape the gravity of what had just been unleashed. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was raw, unfiltered contempt, broadcast live, preserved forever in the unforgiving archives of the internet. Within minutes, hashtags ignited. Screens lit up in bedrooms, offices, and subway cars. On Twitter, the phrase, "Go back to India," climbed the trending charts like wildfire, colliding with memes, rage threads, and video clips chopped down to 7 seconds of venom. Millions of strangers who had never heard the name Kash Patel were suddenly asking, who is this man, and why is he being told to leave his own country? And there he stood, in the center of it all, his eyes locked, his posture rigid, but his silence louder than her insult. He was the hero caught off guard, forced to carry centuries of struggle on his shoulders in a single, trembling moment. Across from him stood the villain of this drama, wearing arrogance like armor, convinced the line would bruise him into retreat. But it didn't, because here is where the story bends. That insult was not just a casual swipe, it was a spark thrown into dry timber. It was the kind of phrase that strips the mask from the American experiment and forces the question we keep avoiding: who truly belongs here? And the answer, the response that Kash Patel delivered, wouldn't just fill the silence of that stunned room, it would rupture it. His words, measured yet piercing, would travel farther than her sneer ever could. They would ignite a debate not only about him, not only about her, but about the soul of America itself. What he said next, no one expected. Go back. 2 words, sharp as glass, echo through America's history like a haunting refrain. They've been hurled across picket lines, muttered in school hallways, shouted from courthouse steps. They were whispered to freed slaves struggling to claim citizenship, barked at immigrants who built railroads with their bare hands, spat at civil rights leaders marching for justice. Each time, the words carried the same poison: you don't belong. And now, in this century, in front of flashing cameras and microphones, those words returned, aimed not at a stranger, not at an outsider, but at a man who had served at the highest levels of American government. Karoline Leavitt delivered them without a flinch. Young, ambitious, and sharp-tongued, she had branded herself as fearless, someone who tells it like it is, no matter the fallout. Her supporters loved the fire, the unapologetic jabs at political correctness. But critics saw something darker, a willingness to wound for attention, a strategy carved from outrage. To them, she wasn't just bold. She was reckless, a voice of division dressed up as candor. And this time, her target wasn't a faceless opponent. It was Kash Patel. Kash's story was the kind America usually celebrates. The son of Indian immigrants, he grew up in working-class neighborhoods where his parents labored endlessly. His father in a factory, his mother in a hospital. They taught him discipline, loyalty, and the stubborn belief that education was the ladder to something greater. Step by step, he climbed it: law school, national security, senior roles inside the Pentagon and the Trump administration. For years, he operated behind the scenes, a strategist rather than a showman. He was not the loudest voice in the room, but often the most prepared, and yet, in a single moment, his identity, not as R.A. Some, became the weapon used against him. The polarity was undeniable. On one side stood Karoline, quick with barbs, thriving on conflict, her smirk suggesting she believed she'd landed the final blow. On the other stood Kash, composed yet visibly shaken, his silence already heavier than any comeback she could prepare. He looked like the underdog, cornered, underestimated. But that perception, that pause, was deceptive. Because this wasn't just an exchange of insults, it was history collapsing into the present. It was the voice of nativism colliding with the story of immigrant perseverance. 2 people, 2 identities, 2 Americas squaring off under the lights while the nation held its breath. Every debate has a stage, but this stage was bigger than them both. The insult wasn't private, it wasn't whispered. It was blasted live, clipped within seconds, and shared across every corner of the internet. By the time the microphones were switched off, the battle lines had already been drawn. Comment sections erupted into digital war zones, half defending Karoline's truth-telling, half rallying behind Kash as the embodiment of an American promise too often questioned. This was not 2 people sparring. This was the weight of America's identity colliding in real time. It was the old ghost of Go Back rising again, testing whether dignity could withstand derision. And in that collision, the nation was about to witness something far greater than a personal insult. It would witness how a man responds when history's ugliest echo is aimed squarely at him. And Kash Patel was ready. Karoline Leavitt didn't stumble into controversy. She cultivated it. From her earliest days in politics, she branded herself as the fearless disruptor, the one who would slice through what she called political theater, with unfiltered honesty. At rallies, she was the spark that drew applause, her words sharp enough to sting and simple enough to trend. Her fans saw in her a warrior against softness, a voice unafraid of confrontation in a world they believed was drowning in caution. But beneath the surface of that image was something more deliberate. Critics claimed her so-called fearlessness was less about truth and more about provocation. They called it dog-whistle politics, a strategy as old as American populism, say just enough to ignite the base, just enough to wound the opponent, but never enough to admit intent. In her speeches, identity wasn't background, it was ammunition. Her opponents weren't just wrong, they were alien, different, suspicious, and every clash was a chance to reinforce the divide. This was her rhythm: outrage, reaction, amplification. The system rewarded it. Headlines multiplied, Twitter threads exploded, bookings on cable news stacked up. The harsher her tone, the larger her following. It was a cycle that transformed sharp insults into currency, each controversy pulling her further into the spotlight. And yet, within that rise was the seed of downfall. By thriving on division, she tethered her reputation to spectacle. Every time she swung harder, she raised the stakes. Each insult needed to be sharper than the last. And in front of those cameras, when she sneered, "Go back to India," it was not an accident. It was the predictable result of a system that had built her into a villain rewarded for outrage, until outrage went too far. Kash Patel's story did not begin in the corridors of Washington power. It began in the quiet exhaustion of immigrant sacrifice. His father, a factory worker, carried the ache of long shifts in his shoulders. His mother, in the sterile hallways of a hospital, traded her own rest for the care of strangers. They arrived with little more than determination, chasing the promise that America, however distant, offered a ladder upward for their children. Kash grew up watching their struggle. The unspoken lesson etched into every meal they skipped, every second job they took: success was not optional, it was survival. School became his battlefield. Each grade won, each barrier crossed, was a victory not just for him, but for the family who had gambled everything on the possibility of his future. Law school followed, then the long climb through government service. Slowly, deliberately he rose, into national security, into the Pentagon, eventually into the Trump administration. His resume was proof of relentless effort, but also of something more: that the American dream was not just a phrase but a reality he embodied, and that is why the insult cut deeper than a personal slight. "Go back to India" was not aimed only at him. It was hurled at every immigrant child who stayed up late studying while their parents worked nights, at every family who believed their sweat could buy belonging. The stakes were larger than one man's dignity. They were the measure of a promise millions had lived and died chasing. Kash knew this. In that moment, standing silent, he wasn't just defending himself. He was holding the weight of a dream too fragile to abandon, too costly to let be mocked. It happened in an instant, but the sting stretched on. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, her voice cutting through the murmur of reporters, eyes narrowed with the smug precision of someone who thought she had delivered the final word. "Go back to India," she sneered, every syllable dripping with contempt. The smirk that followed wasn't casual. It was calculated, the curl of a mouth convinced she had landed a blow that would silence her opponent. The room froze. Reporters, accustomed to heated exchanges, fell into stunned silence. Pens that had scratched furiously across notebooks now hovered motionless. Camera shutters clicked once, twice, then stopped altogether as if the machines themselves understood the weight of what had just been said. The insult hovered in the air, toxic and unshakable. Some in the crowd gasped audibly. Others looked away, unwilling to be caught on camera reacting. Kash Patel did not flinch, at least not outwardly. He stood still, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed, the silence around him so heavy it seemed to bend the air. That stillness became its own spectacle. It was the pause before a storm, a silence louder than any shouted rebuttal. But outside that room, silence was not an option. Within minutes, the clip hit Twitter, posted by a journalist who had caught the insult with perfect clarity. 7 seconds, just enough time to hear the words, see the smirk, and feel the shock. It spread like fire on dry grass. By the time Kash had left the podium, the phrase, "Go back to India," was the #1 trending hashtag in America. Memes arrived next. Some mocked Karoline's sneer, looping it into endless gifs. Others reframed Kash's stoic reaction, painting him as a symbol of unshaken dignity. Late-night comedians seized on it within hours, replaying the clip with exaggerated gasps, their audiences roaring at the sheer audacity. Headlines piled up across news outlets, America's ugliest insult caught on camera. Oh, go back to India. Leavitt's words sparked national outrage. Oh, political theater or racial slur. Cable networks carved up their primetime slots with panels debating whether this was a slip of the tongue or a deliberate strike. The answer hardly mattered. The damage was done, and the narrative was spinning out of control. Karoline's allies scrambled, some doubling down, others pleading context. But the fury online was relentless. For every defense, 10 more voices roared back, "This is what they think of us. This is what they think America is." Meanwhile, Kash Patel became an unwilling centerpiece in the unfolding storm. His name, unknown to many hours before, was suddenly everywhere. Strangers who had never read his biography now knew the outlines of his story, the immigrant parents, the government career, the quiet composure. Overnight, he was transformed into a symbol, not because he had sought it, but because the insult had thrust him there. The escalation reached absurd heights. Protesters carried signs with the phrase, flipping it into defiance. "Go back. We built this." Op-eds dissected the cultural wound reopened by 2 careless words. Celebrities weighed in, hashtags multiplying with every retweet. Even those who had no stake in politics found themselves pulled into the conversation. What had begun as a sneer in a crowded room now spiraled into a national reckoning. And through it all, Kash remained silent. His composure, his refusal to fire back immediately, became its own narrative. Was it restraint? Was it strategy? Or was it the calm before a devastating reply? The world didn't know. They only knew that the man at the center of the storm had not yet spoken, and his silence was deafening. But silence never lasts. The tension had peaked, the outrage had spread, and the nation was waiting, breath held, eyes fixed on Kash Patel. The insult was ugly, yes, but the real shock was still to come, because the story wasn't about what she had said. It was about how he would answer. The silence stretched on, unbearable in its weight. Reporters leaned forward, microphones trembling on thin stands, waiting for the explosion they were certain would come. The insult still hung in the air, raw, electric, venomous, and all eyes locked on Kash Patel, the man who had been told, in front of cameras and a nation, to go back to a country he had never left. Seconds ticked by like minutes. Karoline's smirk lingered, as if daring him to lash out, to give her the fiery clip she could frame as weakness. But Kash did not move. He didn't flinch. He stood with the posture of a man caught between centuries of history and a single moment of choice. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, almost quiet. But in that silence, every syllable landed like a strike of thunder. "My parents came here with nothing." He began, eyes locked not on Karoline, but on the sea of cameras staring back. No money, no connections, just a belief that this country would give them a chance. The room tightened. A few heads nodded instinctively. Reporters scribbled faster, sensing they were no longer covering a press event, but witnessing a moment that would be replayed for decades. They worked in factories. They cleaned hospital floors. They did the jobs nobody else wanted, and they never once asked this nation to give them anything but an opportunity to work harder than anyone else. His tone rose, not in anger, but in conviction. And from that nothing, they built something. They built a family. They built a future. They built me. There was no fury in his words, only dignity. He wasn't defending himself. He was reframing the insult into testimony, carving pride out of the very weapon thrown at him. "So if you're telling me to go back to India," Kash said, his gaze steady, his voice ringing now, "then I will take America with me, because we built this too." The room erupted, gasps first, sharp and collective, then the low thunder of applause rising like a wave. Some reporters clapped despite themselves, abandoning neutrality in the face of conviction. The smirk on Karoline's face faltered, her armor cracked by words she hadn't expected. And online, within minutes, the clip became legend. The insult had spread like wildfire. But Kash's response became the counterflame brighter, hotter, unstoppable. Twitter's outrage threads transformed into praise. Hashtags flipped from anger to admiration. Fen built this do shot to the top of the trends, joined by Phi Kash Patel response and Phi masterclass in dignity. Influencers called it the most powerful comeback in modern politics. Commentators who rarely agreed on anything hailed it as a pivot point, a moment where a slur turned into a lesson. Cable anchors, replaying the footage on loop, framed it as something larger than politics. From insult to masterclass in dignity, one declared. Editorials followed the same rhythm. Kash Patel didn't just defend himself, he defended the idea of America itself. But the true shock was still unfolding in real time. Kash continued, his voice carrying the weight of every immigrant story hidden in America's shadow. For generations, people who looked like me have been told we don't belong here, told to go back. And yet, every time those words are spoken, they reveal a truth. Because if we were to leave, what would this nation be missing? The doctors, the engineers, the teachers, the soldiers, the mothers and fathers who gave everything for this country. Are we not America too? His cadence slowed, deliberate, every sentence hitting like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of her insult. This isn't just about me. It's about the millions who hear those words and wonder if the promise of this nation was ever meant for them. And let me tell you, it is. It always has been, and it always will be. The applause swelled again. Some stood, clapping openly, abandoning protocol. The sound was messy, uncontrolled, emotional. Karoline shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing. But her silence was louder than anything she could have said. And then, as the cameras drank it in, Kash leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering to a near whisper, forcing everyone to listen harder. "You think you've shamed me," he said softly. "But what you've done is remind me of my parents' courage, my family's sacrifice, and the millions who built this country with hands that will never be recognized. I don't need to go back anywhere, because I am exactly where I belong." For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. No one coughed, no one shifted. The tension had transformed into awe, into something heavier, deeper. What had begun as insult had become inspiration, a reversal so complete that the very weapon meant to wound had been broken and reforged into strength. Outside that room, America felt it too. Clips of the response shot across platforms, headlines reframed the moment as a turning point, and supporters, some who had never heard Kash Patel's name before, now spoke of him as a symbol of resilience. The insult had been hers, but the triumph was his. And just when it seemed he was finished, Kash delivered his final words. Words that would be replayed endlessly, dissected, quoted, remembered. "But this isn't over," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, his tone resolute. "Because if in 2024 in America we are still telling people to go back, then the question isn't whether I belong here. The question is, do we?" The gasp that followed was sharper than any applause. Reporters blinked, stunned. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. He had shifted the battlefield, turning the insult back on the nation itself, forcing reflection no one could escape. It was not just an answer, it was a challenge, and no one was ready for it. The moment Kash Patel's words echoed across the airwaves, the question burst into the bloodstream of America. Who gets to define what it means to be American? It wasn't just a political spat anymore. It was an ideological collision. The insult, intended to corner him, had instead unleashed a nationwide reckoning. News cycles churned nonstop. Opinion pages blazed with fiery essays. Podcasts and late-night hosts dissected every line, every pause, every look in that silent room. The debate stretched beyond Kash and Karoline. It became a referendum on identity itself. On one side stood those who clung to the narrow view that American meant lineage, heritage, bloodlines stretching back generations. They doubled down, applauding Karoline's words as truth, telling, insisting that patriotism meant protecting an exclusive cultural identity. Comment threads frothed with voices echoing her sentiment, proof that the rhetoric Kash had endured was far from isolated. On the other side, however, Kash's response resonated like a rallying cry. Immigrant families saw their sacrifices mirrored in his story. Veterans of color shared their own scars of being told they didn't belong, despite fighting under the same flag. Even centrists and moderates, often wary of political theatrics, admitted they felt something stir when Kash said, "If I go back, I'll take America with me, because we built this too." The divide was sharp, but the emotional whiplash was unmistakable. What had begun as an insult to reduce him to the outsider, instead elevated him into a symbol of the very American dream his parents had chased. Social media reflected the split. Hashtags like #PegGoBack tried to weaponize the insult again, but they were drowned out by "Feth built the stew" and "Feck we belong." Television networks replayed the scene as though it were a courtroom drama. Clips of Karoline's sneering were contrasted with Kash's calm poise, a visual of villain and hero so stark it felt scripted. Commentators described it as the moment dignity defeated division. The clash was no longer about two individuals. It had become an emblem of America's struggle with itself. And yet, the power of Kash's reversal lay not only in what he said, but in what it forced others to confront. His words didn't just defend his identity, they challenged the nation's conscience. Who gets to define America? The loudest voices of exclusion, or the millions quietly building its future, one generation at a time? Karoline herself doubled down in the aftermath, refusing to apologize, claiming she had been taken out of context, and that her critics were weaponizing political correctness. Her supporters cheered her defiance, but the broader audience saw her for what she had become, a symbol of a politics addicted to outrage, unwilling to reckon with its own cruelty. Meanwhile, Kash's stature only grew. He was no longer framed merely as a political figure or former government official. He was now a cultural flashpoint, an underdog hero who had turned the ugliest insult into a lesson on belonging. Media outlets called it a masterclass in composure. Commentators from both sides of the aisle admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that his restraint had exposed the moral bankruptcy of the attack. The ideological clash burned brightest in living rooms and kitchen tables. Parents explained to their children why those words, "go back," were so painful, so heavy with history. Teachers wove the debate into lessons about civil rights. Religious leaders preached about dignity and inclusion. It was no longer just a headline, it was a national mirror, held up for all to see. Conflict gave way to catharsis. From the wreckage of insult, people found themselves moved not just by Kash's composure, but by the bigger truth his response illuminated. America's story has always been written by outsiders who became insiders, by hands once dismissed that built legacies impossible to ignore. In the end, awe replaced anger. What began as a sneer meant to diminish him had instead elevated him into something larger than politics. Kash Patel hadn't just defended himself. He had reframed the battlefield, turning one of the oldest weapons of exclusion into a banner of belonging. And across America, the question lingered like a challenge: who truly belongs here? For the first time in a long time, the answer felt undeniable: all of us who build it, all of us who believe in it, all of us who claim it as home. When the cameras dimmed and the frenzy shifted to headlines, hashtags, and talking points, Kash Patel found himself in a rare quiet. The adrenaline had burned off, replaced by a heavy stillness. He replayed the words in his mind. "Go back to India." They rang not as an insult to him alone, but as an echo of something far deeper, a wound stitched into the history of America itself. He sat with that weight. For the first time since the storm began, the armor slipped. He admitted, to himself and to those closest to him, that it hurt. Not because he doubted his place, but because he knew millions of others had no microphone, no stage, no chance to answer back. "This isn't about me," he whispered. "It's about every kid told they don't belong. Every parent who sacrificed everything only to hear their children questioned. Every dreamer who looks at the flag and wonders if it truly looks back at them." The vulnerability was startling. The man who had stood calm before cameras now allowed the truth to sink in. The words had cut, but not in the way intended. They had exposed the fragility of an old prejudice still lurking in the marrow of the nation. And in exposing it, they had opened a door. In living rooms across America, that door was felt. Families watched the replay not just as spectators, but as participants in the question it raised. Parents comforted children who asked why someone would say such words. Elders nodded, recognizing the same slurs hurled at them decades earlier. The silence Kash had endured in that room was now broken by millions of voices insisting, "We belong." What made the moment endure wasn't the spectacle, it was the dignity. His restraint became a mirror, forcing the nation to confront itself. People realized prejudice thrives loudest when met with anger, but falters when met with composure that cannot be shaken. The insult had been sharp, but dignity had blunted its edge. Kash knew his reply wouldn't erase division. The clash would rage on in politics, on screens, in debates yet to come. But in the quiet of reflection, he recognized something profound. Moments like this weren't about winning arguments. They were about giving others the courage to stand, to endure, to claim their place unapologetically. The nation felt it too. What began as shock curdled into numbness, and from numbness rose something stronger: hope. If dignity could triumph in the ugliest moment, then perhaps belonging wasn't a gift handed down by gatekeepers, but a right already earned by those who live, work, and build here. Kash Patel's name would fade in headlines, but the resonance of his words would not. They had become a reminder: belonging is not granted. It is claimed. And with every echo of his answer, millions felt inspired to claim it for themselves. The storm didn't end when the cameras shut off. In many ways, it was only beginning. Within hours, the clip had circled the nation, thousands of times over. Kash Patel's words, steady and unflinching, became the thread running through every newscast, every talk show, every buzzing phone screen. Anchors framed it as the answer America needed. Opinion writers called it masterclass in dignity under fire. And across social media, he was hailed as a voice not just for himself, but for immigrant America. Yet, as the praise poured in, another story unfolded on the opposite side. Karoline Leavitt, once celebrated in certain circles as fearless, was suddenly carrying the weight of her words. What she had meant as a quick jab now echoed as an epitaph. Sponsors pulled statements of support. Allies went silent. Some criticized her openly, branding her comment as a scar that revealed more about her than about the man she tried to diminish. Her image, carefully built on confrontation and spectacle, was fracturing in real time. Still, America being America, the nation split in two. One side elevated Kash as a symbol of resilience, the embodiment of the immigrant story folded into the heart of the American dream. The other insisted Karoline was being canceled, that she had only said what others were thinking. And so, what had begun as one exchange between two figures became a larger question pressing down on the country itself: who really gets to define what it means to belong? Kash, however, didn't wade into the mud. He didn't chase headlines or clap back at critics. He chose silence where outrage was expected. And in that silence, his presence grew louder than any speech could have. It was restraint weaponized into strength. By refusing to swing back, he forced America to keep staring at the mirror his words had left behind. But the aftermath was not without its shadows. In coffee shops and classrooms, in boardrooms and kitchens, people repeated the insult. Some condemned it, others laughed, and still others shrugged it off as just another controversy in a country addicted to outrage. Kash understood this truth. No single moment, no matter how powerful, could erase the undercurrent of prejudice woven through centuries. The question was never whether he had answered well. It was whether the nation would listen long enough for change to take root. The media frenzy roared. Headlines screamed. Patel's calm shatters insult. Leavitt faces backlash. Immigrant pride goes viral. Late-night hosts replayed the clip, mocking Karoline's smirk before pivoting to admiration for Kash's composure. Online, hashtags swelled, "We belong for dignity wins, Fagback no more." The firestorm had all the elements of a national reckoning. But even in the applause, there lingered an uneasy silence, a question that refused to be buried. Would America carry this lesson forward, or simply scroll past it, filing it away with the thousands of viral moments that had sparked outrage but changed nothing? Kash didn't pretend to know the answer. As the days passed, he kept his focus on the message he had left behind, that dignity is not a weapon of the weak, but the foundation of the strong. He reflected on his parents' sacrifices, on the countless families who had walked a path like theirs. He understood the stakes had always been larger than himself. The insult had been personal, yes, but the reply had been communal. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to go back. Karoline, meanwhile, tried to recover, doubling down in some interviews, softening in others. But the damage was done. Where she had once commanded attention, she now carried a cloud. The very system that had rewarded her outrage was now extracting its price. And in that irony, many saw a fitting consequence: a villain unraveled not by an opponent's fury, but by her own excess. Still, the true weight of the story wasn't in her downfall. It was in the questions Kash's answer refused to let die. What does it mean to belong? Who decides? The debate rippled outward, into classrooms, policy discussions, family dinners. Some said it marked a turning point. Others dismissed it as just another viral skirmish, and so the cliffhanger remained. Not whether Kash had triumphed in that moment. He had. But whether the country itself was capable of learning from it. Would the insult fade into memory, another outrage consumed and forgotten? Or would it seed something deeper, a shift in how Americans see themselves and one another? The closing image belonged not to headlines or hashtags, but to Kash himself. Walking out of the building that night, he carried no victory pose, no fist raised to the crowd. He simply moved with quiet resolve, his head high, his expression calm. Around him, applause swelled, not the orchestrated clapping of politics, but the spontaneous roar of people who understood what they had just witnessed. It was not merely support, it was recognition. As he stepped into the night, the cameras caught one last shot: Kash Patel, the son of immigrants, walking forward into uncertainty, leaving behind a nation still wrestling with its reflection. And then, the final words lingered as if carved into the silence he left behind. Sometimes the most American response is simply refusing to surrender your dignity. Karoline told him to go back to India. But instead of shrinking, Kash Patel's words stopped America in its tracks. What was meant as an insult became a turning point, a moment that forced millions to confront a question far bigger than two people on a stage. Who gets to decide who belongs in America? That's why this story doesn't end here, because it isn't just Kash's story, it's yours, too. Every immigrant family, every child who's been told they don't belong, every worker who's been overlooked because of their name, their accent, or their skin color, this moment speaks for them. It speaks for you. So now we ask, if someone told you to go back, what would you say? Would you answer with anger, or would you, like Kash, Answer with dignity, turning insult into power. Comment your answer below, because this debate is not over and your voice matters. And if you believe dignity is stronger than division, hit subscribe, share this story, and join the conversation. Together, we can make sure the next time someone tries to draw the line of who belongs, they'll find millions ready to answer back. Because sometimes, the most American act is refusing to surrender your place at the table.